Again, and welcome to our sixth panel of the two-day conference, Seeing the World Through Sudan, Critical Frameworks for Understanding the Crises and Implications of Sudan's Counter-Revolutionary Wars. This panel is titled Archiving Destruction, and we're going to use the space as a moment to sort of reflect on the media and data ecosystem that is being preserved and maintained by different activists and journalists committed to preserving and documenting the truth of the human rights violations that are occurring in Sudan and have been occurring even before the war. So without further ado, we'll get started. Before we begin, I just want to sort of situate this media ecosystem that we're talking about, and then I'll introduce our two panelists, Ibrahim Al-Hajj and Mosaab Baba. The Sudanese Journalist Syndicate, I think it was about a month ago, reported that 90% of the media infrastructure was completely destroyed and looted in the entirety of Sudan. Communications and internet blackouts have been a weapon of war that the Sudanese government has used since the internet has really become a thing. The last time I really remember it being this bad before the war was at the June 3rd massacre. A few hours after it happened, the internet was completely cut off, and for weeks after, it continued to be that way. Most recently, a few months ago, after the takeover in Jazeera, the internet was cut off in many parts of Sudan for a long time, I think several months at least. And many Sudanese people, have ended up having to rely on things such as Starlink, which is, of course, controlled by the whims of a billionaire from an apartheid state and controlled and facilitated by, the RSF or SAF, depending on where, the technology exists in Sudan. The communications and internet blackout already sort of deepened the complexities of journalistic work and have exacerbated the process of monitoring and documenting crimes and violations, and have really required an innovative and inventive approach that is responsive and reacts to this need to archive in the midst of destruction, despite all the limitations to that. I want to highlight that in, the 5 states of Darfur, particularly, communications have been cut off for more than 8 consecutive months at a time, and up to this day, 80% of Sudan states remain completely out of coverage for more than 4 weeks in just February and March. And as of June 2024, there are a total number of 393 cases of direct violations against journalists and media outlets. But of course, this number is highly underestimated. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Mosaab Baba is the co-founder and media development director at GISA Group, a nonprofit organization focusing on media development, technology adaptation, and access to justice in Sudan and East Africa. And GISA Group also facilitates the Ayin Network, which is a network of journalists who are committed to doing groundbreaking investigative journalism about Sudan, and particularly about the human rights violations that have occurred in the war, but even before it. Ayin was founded in 2013. And then Ibrahim Al-Hajj, to my left, is the archive officer for Sudan Human Rights Hub, a coordination and resource center for Sudanese grassroots human rights groups to strengthen their capacities and collaborate to reach justice in Sudan. Both of these organizations, Ayin and Sudan Human Rights Hub, I think sort of speak to the spirit of the inventiveness that is required of journalists and people committed to, again, preserving the truth of human rights violations in Sudan. Sudan Human Rights Hub is primarily based off of the work of a group of monitors who are based in and around Sudan, many of whom have been displaced internally and externally because of the war. And their responsibility is to scrape social media, to scrape Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, underground channels where people are, everyday citizen journalists are sharing information about human rights violations. And a big part of Sudan Human Rights Hub project is the collaborative archive project, which sees that the data that these monitors collect, as well as the other grassroots organizations that Sudan Human Rights Hub works with, groups that are based in Uganda, Kenya, the UAE. Their data, is sent to Sudan Human Rights Hub, sort of filtered to the different categories of analysis, and then preserved in this collaborative archive project. You can learn more about their work at hrh.org. Yeah, I believe the website is right. And yeah, currently the archive has over probably right now 18,000 pieces of metadata that, are collected and preserved by Sudan Human Rights Hub and then shared with different collaborators such as Iron Network or other legal or historical or journalistic sort of networks and groups that, write stories and analyze the data that Sudan Human Rights Hub has to amplify and share these stories. And yeah, so I think without further ado, we'll get more into sort of the kind of work that Sudan Human Rights Hub and iNetwork do, how they work together, and just have a deeper understanding of the media ecosystem that they operate in and how it's evolved since the beginning of the war. But before, I just want to pass the floor to Mosaab to speak more about Ayin and how it's developed over the past years since its inception. Just more context.
Thank you, Bayan, and thank you to Brown University and everyone who organized this event. I don't want to take too long in talking about Ayn, but just to give an overview of kind of what the team has been doing. I helped manage Ayn, but it was founded by people that were in the conflict zones, specifically within Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile. There's people like Hajuj Kuka who was there in the beginning. So we kind of took over the management of it and started going forward with how to expand it. So if we take a look at Ayn, of course, we started in 2013. And, since 2013, we started expanding to the rest of Sudan. And of course, 2018 came around and we're like, okay, this is the biggest kind of moment within the journey of Sudanese towards democracy, towards liberation. So we, kind of enhanced our operation before that, but we were there for the entire stretch, from 2018 through the beginning of the war. We'll talk about that in a few. We had kind of some main key points or goals for Ryan, which is, holding the powerful to account being the main thing. The lack of accountability in Sudan going back decades was partially due to, the blackout on information, the censorship of media, and people really not having access to find out what's going on in different parts of Sudan and build bridges as well. Many people from around Sudan will tell you that, even, before 2018, before the war, and even after 2018, there was a huge disconnect between the center and the peripheries. People in the areas where the war is raging on for decades were trying to get their voice across to people in Khartoum to say that, what we're going through is something that you can't really imagine being in the confines of Khartoum or any of the central areas of Sudan. So bridging that gap was one of the things, but also, kind of fostering the new generation of journalists and of media practitioners in Sudan, especially young people, women who haven't really been within the journalism sphere in Sudan, and to allow them to tell their stories and tell the stories of their communities. We kind of had more, three general areas or themes that we focused on: the conflict causes and effects. This was a big one for us because a lot of us have been paying attention. Those of us who are a little bit older, we saw how little information was coming in from the South Sudan war, then from the Darfur conflict, and there was a complete disconnect. And further than that, like, why have we seen perpetual warfare in Sudan? Like that needs to be unpacked on a regular basis, and allowing people around Sudan to say why they're seeing this and what are the symptoms and what are the possible prescriptions to bring peace in Sudan. The grassroots reporting is kind of our modus operandi. We didn't like the idea. We appreciate journalists coming into Sudan to cover, but parachuting in and telling the stories is not enough. Like, people within the different areas, to empower them to tell their own stories was kind of the main mechanism for us to be able to get the to bridge that gap and to tell the story of Sudanese. And of course, having a human rights basis for all of this, where, you know, we're clearly not pro-war media, and we want to focus mainly on the violations of human rights, but, you know, add a little, you know, more nuance to it rather than just be, you know, reports coming out and then forgetting about the issue. What are the trends, you know, and it falls kind of into the causes and the effects of the conflict as well. This is just currently we have, you know, reporters on the ground that are dispersed in different areas of Sudan. Of course, we can't cover the entire map, but like enabling people to travel within Sudan and everything. And this is where I kind of have to stop and say that, you know, the teams that we work with on the ground are heaven sent. You know, I can't give them enough credit for taking on these risks of doing the coverage and doing it safely and maintaining the journalistic standards is just something that we can never, I can never, you know, appreciate enough, and kind of humble myself to look at them as heroes, you know, on the ground, men and women. So since the conflict started, we had to kind of shift gears a little bit. Before the war, a lot of focus was on the pro-democracy movement and, you know, the grassroots activism and what the changes that were happening in Sudan. But then, of course, the war, when it started, we started looking at the amount of devastation, and we had to kind of keep our eyes on the kind of biggest impact and where people were being most affected in Darfur and Khartoum. And but more importantly, what are citizens doing about it? You know, Ibrahim Snoopy earlier was saying that, you know, Sudanese are very resilient. You know, some of the most resilient, you know, actions from the citizens of Sudan in light of the war. You know, it's the biggest humanitarian disaster on the planet, but so many Sudanese have responded to it. So we wanted to kind of highlight that as well. And the issue of displacement, of course, whether it's internal or refugees. Because even before the war, like for example, Sudan, Darfur had close to 3 million refugees before the war, IDPs. So, you know, now 12 million being displaced, it's something that we constantly shed light on just to bring more attention to. There's some stories of impact. I won't go into too much details just to keep mind of time. With investigations, we have different formats. So sometimes we're doing short video reports. Sometimes we're doing investigative reports that take a few months. And this is where it's difficult because you have to switch your mode of production. And but in the end, we try to make it as impactful as possible and work with partners as well. We have a lot of the national partners with some of the media outlets in Sudan, like Darfur 24, Radio Dabanga, Sudan Bukra, to try and foster also a sense of collaboration among Sudanese media. Because, you know, a lot of people who are more competition minded would like to think that, yeah, I want to get the scoop on this story and stuff. But what's more important to us is working with the other Sudanese national media to have stories of impact and investigations and everything, because we're in a very different situation than the regular, you know, rat race of, you know, competition among media outlets. Further than that, in August, we were founding members of the Sudan Media Forum, which now has close to 30 independent media outlets. And this is also a response to the fact that most of the media, whether it's print or broadcast in Sudan, has stopped after the war. So now how do we get journalists back in, you know, and develop media and develop capacities and figure out ways of sustainability for these outlets so that they can actually be the voices of the people on the ground and do the proper coverage and the journalism that they need to do. Also working with international media. I mean, you know, it's the most difficult thing. Of course, any journalist knows that pitching to international media is really difficult. We were just talking about this in the break during lunch with Yasmin. It's like we couldn't figure out what resonates with an international audience. You know, you keep throwing so many things, but what resonates a lot of times is just random, and whatever goes viral and catches on fire, is, you know, anybody's guess. But we have to keep on this because each one of these outlets have millions of viewers, a lot more than we have. So it becomes a strategic goal for us to work with them and constantly knock on their door and pitch stories to them so that the story of these Sudanese can get out to a lot more people. We also, the capacity building, the training, each one teach one. You know, we've been since day one working with civil society and with other journalists and with other media to develop their capacity so that they can tell their own stories. We need to kind of decentralize the tools themselves of storytelling and of journalism so that everyone can actually tell their story. So we have a special emphasis on capacity building and on training as well. GISLA, of course, is our ecosystem that we work in, and with our partners that we've worked with. Of course, Sudan Human Rights Hub is here, and you know, it's one of our main partners when it comes to doing investigations, verifying certain incidents, things like that. You know, before the war, there was civic labs who were more the civil society, the younger people, working with them and developing their capacity. Collaborative Futures. I have a tech background, but you know, we understand that we're working more in a digital space. So being, you know, proficient in the new trends is pretty important as well. Uh, uh, we've had some moderate success when it comes to reaching audiences and, you know, engagement and getting followers and stuff like that. And we've seen a bit of an increase within audience and engagement. You know, since the beginning of 2023 until now, we, you know, despite if you see this graph, you know, you see around November when the internet went out, there was a dip in those numbers, but they picked back up once connectivity started getting back and once people started using Starlink for internet access. So we kind of try to attribute it more to people needing an anti-war narrative, people needing media that actually represents them where they see themselves in around Sudan, not just like the mainstream media and how it's been operating in Sudan, but the narrative also of the government. Now this changed a little bit, of course. Sadly, with the war, we're starting to see like the pro-SAF, pro-government, or even pro-RSF media filling up a lot of the void that's there for the information. So it's a huge challenge for us right now. But the public is actually open to building bridges. Like some of the highest engaged content that we've had has been refugee communities in Chad and in South Sudan, in Uganda, all these areas where people want to see what other Sudanese are actually going through. And especially when it's, you know, families and people that can actually relate, you know, on screen. So I'll keep it at that and hand it over to Bayan. So thank you.
Thank you, Mosaab, for that presentation and for sharing more about Ayan's work and the context in which Ayan operates. As you were talking, I thought back to a conversation we were having yesterday. I think it was, yeah, the last panel, our Solidarity and Discontents panel, where we sort of, you know, confronted what it means to like constantly, you know, ask for people to pay attention for Sudan and having to sort of compete within the attention economies of destruction. And when there's so much destruction like ravaging the world, having so much of the battle be that, unfortunately, be that, you know, Sudan must also be considered. And we ended up at a really good point, and, you know, guided by Yasmin, you know, where it's not just enough to ask for attention, but like what happens when we get that attention? Like how was that platform used? What are the narratives that are constructed with that attention? Attention simply isn't enough. And so my question to both of you is like, so, you know, in collecting this data and preserving this data and working within like, you know, within these sort of collaborative networks, like how do you make sure that that narrative is one that is rooted in justice, like through and through until the end? Because once you put it out into the world, like it's kind of out of your control. So yeah, I guess like what is your relationship to the news you put out and like the afterlives of it, if that makes sense? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bayan, and thank you so much, Brown University and all the organizers of the conference. It should be on. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bayan, Brown University, and all the organizers of the conference. Um, Throughout the history of conflict in Sudan, we have witnessed uh, brutal violence against several groups and ethnic and geographical areas. But all of these violence were unacknowledged and unrecorded. And this affected the social cohesions of Sudanese people, especially for those who are inside Sudan during if we considered South Sudan war, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, and Darfur war, a lot of brutal violence happening there without the acknowledgement of the other parts of Sudan about what they are happening. So that highly affected, and that raised the immunity of the people that they are governing, and even the war parties and war traders. They just go over all of these with a political agreement or any kind of peace agreement and forget everything before that. But during Sudan Revolution 2019, things have changed, and most of the violence that happening during the protest and revolution was recorded and live streamed for people, and that highly affected the public opinion and even the Sudanese opinion regarding the regime. That also aided a lot of legal entities and media entities on how to produce and make investigations and case filing regarding the violence happening in Sudan. Uh, During this conflict, the funny thing that most of the warring parties, RSF and SAF, are the ones who are documenting and reporting and publishing their violations against civilians, despite their endeavors and great endeavors or erasing all of this evidence. But most of the documenters working on that, on preserving this data. We in Sudan Human Rights Hub started documenting violations against civilians in Sudan since the revolution, and we have developed our system, our database, and we have developed a system that having monitors from different parts of Sudan and outside Sudan. That their main thing, they were trained in a good way just to monitor and erase all the social media and document, preserve these violations that happening when it's happening. And we are fighting some of the algorithms of social media, especially Facebook and the other platforms that don't even allow to preserve and save these violations, and some of them just take them down. So yeah, we are working on documenting these violations. I think that affected in aiding different of social media and legal entities to having information from the ground that's happening now, and giving them good and credible and valid data for making their investigations and making even their file casing regarding the violence happening in Sudan. I hope I answered the question, or we continue.
I think, yeah, you could talk more in depth about sort of the relationship.
Mhm.
Thanks, Silvio. I think, yeah, if you could sort of talk more in depth about the nature of the relationship between Sudan Human Rights Hub and sort of the partners it works with, and how that information is shared. And then after, once we sort of have that platform to share that data, how do we sort of control the narratives around it, and making sure that, for instance, the data that Sudan Human Rights Hub gives isn't, used to promote a SAF narrative, or God forbid, God forbid on both sides, but, a SAF or RSF narrative, and that, that the complexity of what we're trying of this idea of justice and what justice will look like, and how it sort of breaks away at the power structures that have defined Sudan, are sort of maintained, even though a lot of data that comes out about Sudan is very very anti-RSF, because they're the ones usually documenting themselves on TikTok, and they're a bit egregious, and they're much more sort of theatrical with the way that they document their crimes, so they get a lot of press and play because of their own doing. And so in that case, it's kind of a slippery slope when say, for instance, all of the information you're getting is about RSF. How do you make sure, okay, yeah, we're trying to highlight that the crimes that they do, but we're also trying to make sure and balance that, the RSF and SAF and all of the other sort of and militarized groups that they enable and depend on are part of this system of violence. It's not just one side or the other. But that's my question to both Anya and Sudan Human Rights Hub. So
Okay, so we can start. So mainly when we started documenting violations during the revolution, we have been only 4 or 5 monitors working during the protests that happening and just collecting this data. But during the conflict, as you all witnessed, that the violence scale has raised to extremely way. So we had to have more monitors inside and outside Sudan, just to be able to document all of these violations that happening. And also we have a lot of grassroots organizations that working on the same escape on the same way. So we started training our monitors to work professionally. As you said, that we don't like support either RSF or SAF, but RSF, they commit the most violations that happening in all over Sudan, and they don't even like having an organized leadership just to stop this, or even controlling publishing their violations against civilians. So we document everything, we monitor everything, preserve everything, and then we have a second step validation, like a light touch review for these pieces of information that collected from different states and from different parties of the world. And also we have the validation process. We don't let anything go. We just work professionally on validating the data that we have. As any war context, we have a lot of disinformation that happening. And during our validation, we find a lot of like pieces of information coming from outside Sudan and coming from like historical things that happening maybe a way time behind. So we work on preserving this data. We work on assisting the other organizations on having the professional way of documenting this data. That's why SHRH are credible for information, and we already shared some of the information with international entities with very high standard of validation and verification of data, like the Conflict Observatory and UN FFM fact-finding mission and other things. So the main thing we do is just collecting this data and make sure that all of these data are preserved. Even for this social media platforms, they don't allow to preserve their data, like the Facebook. And we also monitor the other platforms like Telegram, special group in WhatsApps, and we have TikTok, and we have a lot of things. After that, we validate this data professionally and preserve them so we can use it in either investigation or sharing them with the other data entities that required, right?
I think just to also just echo what Ibrahim is saying, but also the idea of what are you documenting for? Where is it going? What is the impact of it? There's been, very little attention. Of course, most of the attention is going more to the humanitarian effort, towards, negotiations to stop the war and things like that. Naturally, these are the focuses in times like this. But little by little, the issue of accountability is starting to surface a little bit. Even if we've seen recently, there's been escalations, there's been, the RSF is now accusing Egypt of entering into the conflict. People are afraid of the conflict actually spilling over into other countries. And the issue of impunity has been always central to this. So with mechanisms like, the UN FFM, people are a little bit wary of the UN and how ineffective it is. But in the end, still, any kind of mechanisms like that would at least give people a little bit hope towards like, okay, if we actually use our documentation and, human rights defenders are working with international bodies, there is at least something that's registered as, for the record, here are the violations that happened. And here are some of, the last FFM report, one of the recommendations was to have a peacekeeping force in Sudan. Internationally and regionally, there's no appetite to like form a force and just throw it into Sudan like this. But now a conversation of, would it be better to have a mission from the AU and complement it with local actors in Sudan, and not to have it as just some alien force coming in, but to have it actually something that's more of a hybrid solution. These are the kind of things, conversations that start coming up. It's hard to do, hybrid tribunals right now to put, for war crimes and stuff like that. But at least the documentation of the human rights violations will lead to that point little by little. So it's almost like, and there is an opinion from even some people in the legal field that say, well, the issue of accountability, bringing it up right now, hinders the peace efforts. You know what I mean? There's this whole thing of, is it, stability or is it justice? These questions are never answered absolutely. I don't think there's a way to actually answer them comprehensively, but at least having it within the conversation and within the discourse itself, the issue of accountability and the human rights documentation gives a very solid foundation for that accountability. So yeah, just to give a little bit of context to it.
I kind of want to zoom back a bit because I think it's most interesting that Sudan Human Rights Hub was founded in 2019 after the December Revolution, and then Ayn was founded in 2013. I'm not sure if it was around the time of the protests that were happening in Khartoum, but both sort of existed within the context of like responding to uprisings of various scales. And so I'm interested in sort of hearing your perspective about the differences in sort of documenting revolution and then documenting destruction and documenting counter-revolution, and how your strategies have changed and your approaches have changed, and also how the message that you're trying to get out with the media that you document or the media that you preserve has changed in the course of these past few years.
Just do it, something brief. When we first started, it was very alien. I'm a little bit older, they're in the, 90s and remembering the propaganda of the war in South Sudan, ducking the, mandatory enlistment with SAF and just like radio, television, magazines, everything. This, anti-Southerner, pro-jihad kind of discourse. Anything outside of that was just non-existent. But, little by little, once the digital space started opening up, people started to see a different, perspective and started, you have people expressing themselves. But until we got into 2011 and then 2012, that's when you started seeing people taking the digital space seriously and actually going there for information. But it was still a very uphill battle. If you're covering the war in South Kordofan, you were still, until 2013 and 2014, you're still faced with the juggernaut of like pro-government media in Khartoum. So actually for us, before Ayn, there was, Nuba Reports. And Nuba Reports was in English language and meant for the international community to let them know about the indiscriminate bombings, about, the bombing of farmlands, impoverishing people. And like it was basically ethnic cleansing that was going on in these areas. But then we looked around and we're like, wait a minute, like Sudanese need this more than the international community, because the reason these things are happening are because of that disconnect that we spoke about earlier. So the lead up to 2018, it was kind of in different waves. So you had the 2013 protests, which we've, covered partially. Then you started having things like civil disobedience campaigns in 2016, where a huge number of youth started becoming active on these public issues. So by the time you actually got to December 2018, it was almost like people were ready to get the alternative information, the independent journalism and independent coverage. And the good thing is that by that time, Sudanese youth were already pretty savvy in telling their stories and being active online and conveying messages and doing coverage and putting footage from the protests online and everything. So it's almost like when that happened, like, the burden on independent media like us was pretty light, because there was already so much happening in the digital sphere. And then became an issue of how do we transcend and then start doing broadcast media? How do we start, working on radio so that people around Sudan, if they're, in IDP camps or anything, can also get our message? And that still is, of course, a question mark until now. But the change in attitude has been pretty clear. There was clear refusal for any kind of alternative narrative in like 2013 and 2014. But by 2018, there was much wider acceptance for, just the fact that what we're seeing on Sudan national television is really not what's happening on the ground. Yeah.
So for Sudan Human Rights Hub, our main contribution was focused on the open source. And open source, like during the social media revolution, we have a lot of open source things that happening, and we can predict it. When we started in 2019 and documenting the violations of the government against the protesters and the civilians in Sudan, uh, I wouldn't say it's that very easy, but it was way easier than the documentation after the war, because it was predictable. You know the schedule of the processions, you know the place of the procession, you know the forms of violence could happen, either bullet points or arresting or torture or even tear gas or these things. So we can just place monitors just to following up certain pages and certain social media accounts and platforms, and we know that, and collecting the live streams that happening during the protest, and that's it. But after the war, the forms of violence have changed. The places of violence have changed. We cannot predict anything. Anyway, you can find like the fields of the battles are expanded. So it was very difficult to cover all of this at the same time. With also we have the internet blackout during the war, and a lot of things that are happening here. So we had to like raise the number of our monitors and having a platform of collaborators from the ground, and also trying to find a way of covering that incidents from places that they don't have internet, especially like Al Jazeera. When RSF took over Al Jazeera, we found a lot of like just post about the violations, sexual violations and killing and attacking villages of civilians, but we don't have any kind of media or materials that can publish because of the internet blackout. So we try to manage all of this, and even this same happened when RSF took over Al Jineena and did all of their violations without any kind of documentation of this. And this also put our, not only the journalists in Sudan, also the eyewitnesses and the victims in Sudan, and anybody have any evidence of violence in their smartphones, it's very difficult to move around it anywhere. So it was like very difficult to collect these data. So like we try to covering this by having monitors in different places, and also having organizations that collecting their data, and we provide them with the platform, a safe platform to collect and to gather this data and preserving it. So this comes when we started developing our new database in AWS, Amazon. It was good and secure, and we have the full control, and we can give those organizations the control over their database, so they can preserve their data in a certain way, and it's an easier way. Before the revolution, before the war, we like just working on the normal Excel sheets, and it's very difficult in terms of having it in your computer, and also in terms of using the internet. So we developed two forms of data collection. The first form is WhatsApp chatbot. Just transfer these cells in the Excel sheet or in the master view of the database into questions. So you can just having a chat with the WhatsApp bot and preserving the data, submit the evidence, and just delete everything. So that assisted our monitors in collecting this data, and our also partners to collect this data and having their safety and security when they are existing in the warring places.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think you both sort of like talked about like the shifts in public perception and like willingness to accept alternative forms of media, but also like the infrastructural changes of like, how the reality of war has just made it challenging to collect more data, and how like there needs to be these more pragmatic sort of responses to how you maintain and protect that data, and also how you protect the people collecting it. But I think at the same time, it's interesting you mentioned that, public perception has changed and people are more open to receiving non-propaganda based news, because I feel like at the same time there's such a hunger almost for disinformation, and like disinformation takes up so much space, and disinformation exists in so many different places, and generationally like can reach everybody via WhatsApp, via different forms of social media, and the way that things are spread, like they're able to spread like wildfire in many ways. And I feel like there's also a comfort in the sorts of disinformation that we receive. They sort of, fulfill biases or perceptions that we have of different communities and ethnic groups and religious groups in Sudan. So I'm wondering, yeah, like where I and Sudan Human Rights Hub both sort of see themselves in relation to the struggle against disinformation, which has only increased since, both warring parties and their, the different militarized groups that they depend on and enable, and like their ideological sort of machines and weaponry have only become more savvy, especially in the case of the RSF, which has a Canadian PR firm and has the UAE sort of, helping clean up their image, and people also finding it, we talked about this a lot yesterday, people wanting there to be a hero in this story, whether it's SAF or whether it's RSF. There's almost like a need to believe in sort of the lies that are told to us because they satiate some sort of, fear of or sense of loss, or they make sort of things feel maybe perhaps as not as dark as they are. So yeah, I just want to hear more about your guys' work in relation to disinformation.
Actually, even before working on documentation, Gesa had an experience with this information. We had the research of we conducted a comprehensive research about disinformation against civil society in Sudan, especially the civil society organizations during the revolution who have been working on resisting the government. And it was we had results that the state also contributes in the main contributor of disinformation to Sudan was the state itself. They are having strategies of making this information, publishing it, achieving its goals, and also creating new disinformation campaigns after campaign after campaign after campaign. So we created and developed a small curriculum of online course about how to counter disinformation and the main weaknesses of the organizations, civil society organizations that affected or potentially affected by disinformation, how to build a good communication strategy to stop disinformation, and how to predict the disinformation and counter it. And the most important thing is also creating some public awareness about how to make just simple fact checking to understand disinformations. And also, when you scrape the disinformation in the social media, you can find some of the people from your community and trusted people for you, and even trusted institutions fail in either disinformation or misinformation itself unintentionally things. So this is also one of the things that we have been working, and it's very difficult, by the way, to discover this disinformation before you fell down it, because it's most likely coming from the people who are like-minded to you. So you don't have an effort trying to find a way, is this disinformation or not disinformation. And during the war, this increased to a huge number of things. Even for our monitors, we found that anybody have some doubts about the data that they have collected, they just bring it to the monitoring group and asking them whether this happened or no. They're asking about some things happening in different states in Sudan. Also, the general culture and understanding the context of Sudan also help to people to understand and differentiate between these disinformation and other things. So the main thing we have been working to counter this. Actually, not countering disinformation, just discovering this is a disinformation and preventing ourselves from failing out on collecting disinformed data or misleaded or being misleaded for any entity like SAF or RSF or even other political and other components to achieve their goals by having us collecting the data and preserving or serving their goals. So we're just having some trainings of fact checking and differentiate between those things. So yeah, this.
I think with on the media side, since day one, our main goal was to amplify the actual voices on the ground. And we think that that's the best deterrent to misinformation, to hate speech, to these things, because, it's one thing for a news presenter to sit in front of a camera and tell you that this is going on. But when you hear it from the people that are actually affected, it just cuts through a lot. It cuts through a lot of the misinformation. It cuts through a lot of this stuff. But the war right now is a different dynamic. This is the first time the centers of power that actually controlled the media and the narrative and everything have experienced the war on their grounds. In Khartoum, in Al-Liza'a, all of these places are actually experienced the war. So there's a lot of trauma that comes along with that. So that thirst for the misinformation, a lot of it is coming from, a natural instinct for survival. The RSF, it's very hard for them to keep up any kind of, even if they want to clean their image or anything, the amount of evidence is overwhelming, and with part of the reason why we do our coverage, because we want a track record. You know, we put out a documentary in 2017 called The Militia State, like breaking down like decade by decade how the use of tribes and like, arming certain tribes and having them going on the rampage, how that came about, like going back to the 70s and through the 80s and 90s with experts who've actually, studied this a lot. It's a very uphill battle because you can do the best content that you can, but the misinformation, because it's more sensational, there's a thirst for it. It travels much faster, much wider, gets a lot more engagement. But in the end, like, we even sometimes think within the team, we're saying that, okay, 30% of what we do is kind of, the news value of what's going on right now. But 70% of that value is documentation for the future. So that, just so that we have a very clear record of, what was going on in Sudan. That being said, right now with the war, still raging on, unfortunately, we are starting to see little by little, the clear misinformation getting a little bit less attention and people kind of going towards, and we've seen where there's like Facebook pages and people who are giving a very clear-eyed account of the war getting a lot more traction than they used to. And where you have the usual pro-war mouthpieces and stuff kind of being a little bit in disarray. It's happening little by little, and it's we don't have a very good way of measuring it, but you can kind of see it within the rhetoric that's coming out. And frankly, the breakdown of the rhetoric on both sides of like, we're going to eliminate the other group and we're not going to stop until they're completely gone. Clearly, a year and a half later, there's no military solutions for this. And I think people are starting to realize this little by little, even people who are very pro, one side or the other. So I might be a little bit over optimistic, but yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, like this, it's an insane war. Like everything about it, the build up to it, the intentions behind it, the dynamics of it on the ground, what people are actually going through, the suffering that's happening. Like there's no reason for this war to continue. And I think the overwhelming majority are starting to see that and starting to understand that, there's never been a war that happened in Sudan. As much as we've seen perpetual warfare, there is no other, there's no war that ended with a military victory. Every single one of the wars that we've seen have ended with negotiations. So it just becomes a question of how and all that. And that's reflecting kind of within the media sphere as well, with, very small wins in that regard. But, we're starting to see it.
Yeah, thank you. I think this conversation has sort of led me to think sort of about like the traditions of storytelling that we have as Sudanese people, and especially like thinking back to the conversation with Ibrahim, Snoopy, and Ahmed about sort of, the fact that filmmaking and documentation, artistic documentation of Sudan, like in and outside of the violence that Sudanese people have experienced, has like long been integral to who we are as Sudanese people. And I think particularly photography has long been like a medium that Sudanese people, since like the post-colonial era, have like used to document our stories. And I feel like, especially after the revolution, it seemed like everybody had a camera, like a long DSLR, and was documenting everything. And you had this sort of uprise and people like taking, yeah, like trying to capture like what felt like these fleeting moments of revolution. And so I've always felt like there's like a long sort of aesthetic and political tradition of remembering that Sudanese people sort of rely on to tell stories about these things that almost feel like ingraspable sometimes. So I just wanted to hear you guys sort of both speak more to like where both Ayan and Sudan Human Rights Hub fit in a sort of tradition of like Sudanese journalistic, historical traditions, record keeping, archiving, what genealogy sort of you are all pulling from, if there is one, if you're reinventing the wheel.
Okay. As for Human Rights Hub, we following the media. So with whatever is published in the media, we can find it and can see it. But during the recent war, the political polarization like reach out to the peak of it. Not only political, the polarization in general. Okay. Can you hear? Okay. Okay. So it's not only the political, the polarization in general, the geographical polarization and the ethnic polarization. And even people got back, I think, decades or even centuries to the back, and they're now just relying on their tribal backgrounds in Sudan. Before the war, that was very good because you see a lot of traditions. So, for example, the tribes that considered as incubators of RSF have very beautiful and loved music and traditions to Sudan, like the Western Arabs in Sudan, and they started already publishing a lot of songs that gone viral in Sudan. But after the war, now we have this polarization has affected negatively the culture in Sudan and the traditions in Sudan, and also this was connected to like the violations of the government against those people, because we have now the law of foreign faces. This law is applied in northern Sudan, that because if you are coming from certain places, or even if written in your passport that you are born in certain place, you are accused of this, of where you born. So we are following the media and we see these traditions, and we have the both sides, like the negative side of considering this belonging, like geographical belonging or ethnic belonging or tribal belonging, as a crime itself in Sudan. And also we have the other side of having a lot of culture and traditions and the social cohesions that going ups and downs this side. So this polarization, the main problem of it, that is led by the warring parties, and all the other civilians and organizations are independent. Like when I think of this, I think of why we don't have like some civil societies working out of the warring parties, working on having like rebuilding this cohesion between different societies and communities of Sudan, that all of them are affected either by SAF or by RSF during this war. So yeah, we have like a polarization in the media, and we are just following up that and following up what's happening and what's going on during these things.
I think Ayn has kind of a, influences coming from different areas. It's kind of an amalgamation of different, efforts and different, DNA that kind of led to Ayn. Some of the group of the people who were started working with Ayn early on came from things like Ajras al-Hurriya. Ajras al-Hurriya was a newspaper that was during the CPA period from 2005, 2011. And it was kind of a breath of fresh air, because this is the first time where you had journalists that have seen the war in South Sudan and Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile and these areas, where now they have the pen and they can actually write and reach a huge audience. You had people like Hajuj Kuka, who did that for Skeleton and Beats of the Antonov, bringing that visual storytelling element to it. And then just, doing, guerrilla journalism, things like the Girifna movement, like being an influence on it. So we've kind of came at a time where a lot of these efforts kind of led to almost like an inevitability of something like Ayn popping up. But it goes even further than that. You have people like Taib Saleh with his writings, Minayna to Aula. You have newspapers in Sudan that are more political. You have like Al Maidan and these different newspapers. So you had a rich tradition of Sudanese journalism and activism that have kind of intersected. And Gabe was talking to the people, taking on the people's issues and talking to the people. So we kind of came as a result of that tradition, but we were lucky enough to have the digital space where, you don't need a big camera with like a VHS tape and running out with like its lighting person. Now it's very compact. So we were lucky to come at a time where the mobile journalism, where mobile filmmaking and stuff like that is a lot easier, and anyone can kind of pick up with the proper training and capacity building. So we like to like tip our hats off to like those who came before us. Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience, which I think would fit really nicely with the flow of this discussion that's going. It's from Ines At-Tayyib. And Ines says, how do you ensure that your coverage remains dynamic and unbiased, especially with the fast-changing opinions among civilians and shifts in the political landscape? What mechanisms do you use to maintain objectivity when reporting on political parties while reflecting the truth amidst the ongoing conflict in Sudan? And if I may, Ines, to add to that question, like, is there even can journalism ever be objective?
I mean, complete objectivity is robotic. Like that, I don't think that actually happens. But the idea is to have balance and to have diversity within the team. People who have different political, ideological backgrounds, gender differences, age differences, all of these things add to more of a balance. You know, we've, you know, and basically, if you're not insulted and like painted as some kind of, whatever, you're not, I don't think you're actually doing your job. Like I remember we used to be called like, Israeli spies. And then during the transitional period, these are spoilers, want to overthrow the government. And then, so there's always something. And like right now, pro-staff people are like, this is an RSF page. There's always something, and there's always some mudslinging going on. But I think because we try to keep that balance. But the real key to it, especially in journalism, is to have a diverse group of journalists that are actually have different backgrounds and everything, and to kind of accommodate for that. If we don't have those talents internally, that if we have a blind spot, we need to acknowledge what those blind spots are editorially. And also bringing in some non-Sudanese eyes onto it, just to kind of see like, hey guys, you guys are kind of, biased a little bit on this or that. There are some things that I don't believe have objectivity, authoritarianism, fascism, these kind of things. There's no room to be like, both sided. Neo-colonialism is not a both sides thing. It is really a power balance thing that's more from one side. So I believe these kind of things are not the kind of things where we can think about it and say we have to be objective and fair to both sides or anything. But when it comes among the Sudanese kind of array of people who believe in the basic things, the journalism is supposed to be, the fourth estate, as they say, so we do believe in democracy, we believe in civilian rule, we believe in having like a professional military that answers to civilians. Like these kind of things are part of the DNA of journalism and what journalism should actually, what kind of environment it can stay in. So there's also not really like, I don't see any, both siding it when it comes to that. So, but when it comes to other issues, when it comes to ideological backgrounds, when it comes to even regional issues, but more importantly, to let people from the community to tell the story of the community rather than anyone else parachuting in and telling their story from them. So I'll keep it at that for the objectivity part.
Okay. For us, I think it's just try. It's on. It's on now. Okay. For us, it's just. I remember something called the wisdom of public. This is run by the algorithms of the social media platforms. That anything that goes viral is the right thing. The algorithms consider that is the right thing. So the understanding this way how social media works and how the open source platforms work will help a lot in managing this. And also this means the public opinion also led by the social media and even created by the social media. So you maybe if you could follow or could understand certain things, you can go out of this things. So when we publish our investigations that coming out of the intake of our monitoring process and these things, we're trying to make it as soon like as best as we can. During our weekly meeting of the monitors, we know the themes of the things that are happening. So we don't follow the opinion of the public. We follow the trends of the incidents that are happening rather than the the opinion of the public. So when you have the trend, we have some significant incidents that happening during the week, and you follow up with that, and you create an investigation or monitoring or even small news about the themes of the things that happening, you will find yourself independent from these opinions of people and covering the most recent and the most important thing for the people. So that makes like put us in a good position regarding anything that happens.
So, as a historian of the 19th century, I kind of envy journalists because you guys are historians of the present, and you're able to sort of use the different tools of analysis that historians have, looking at trends over time to talk about things that people are facing like in real time. And yeah, as a historian, I really envy that. It's much more lively than being in an archive and thinking about these sort of long durée historical processes, which feel like they don't have as direct of an impact as journalism. So I'm wondering, given that you guys take up this really important role, especially in this context of, disinformation and misinformation, and the infrastructure of media reporting in Sudan being completely decimated, if not almost, what is your role in sort of shaping public discourse? Do you feel like you you should, or that you do push things forward beyond what is probably comfortable within like mainstream discourse? Do you follow do you follow the people, or do you or do you shape public discourse and push it further than where it currently is? Like, yeah, what is your role in sort of shaping and guiding and naming and confronting history? I know that's a big question, so.
It's a pretty big one, but the idea of following what's going on the ground, and honestly, we also instead of looking at it as shaping opinions are already shaped for a lot of people, especially, look at our model. A lot of times we depend, for example, on civil society to do coverage. Civil society in general has been very vocal about the issues that are facing the people, about pretty much, diagnosing the, problems in Sudan. And doing that, we kind of, it's almost like we have a compass in front of us. So the amplifying of voices also becomes what we do, but at the same time, raising questions like to sway public opinion or to steer it into a certain direction. If you're a big broadcast media, then yeah, you have the ability to do that. But for most of us as independent media, smaller outlets, stuff like that, it's very difficult to do that. But then it goes into the journalistic ethics themselves. We don't want to shape opinion, but just ask the questions, constantly ask the questions. We do, even in our investigative reports. If a journalist comes with a hypothesis of, I think this is going on because 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is the effect. Okay, you have to prove it. Like, you have to bring evidence, and you have to bring sources, and you have to do the field reporting and the research and stuff to actually prove that. We're not going to take your word for it. A lot of the journalism that we see in Sudan are opinion pieces, unfortunately. But this is internationally. I mean, the biggest followed media right now are opinion pieces. Like, nobody's sitting there and fact checking like what Joe Rogan is saying, or like, you know what I mean? Or Christoph, or any of one of the mainstream media figures, because people take their word. You have to get I mean, there are some scandals and stuff in mainstream media where journalists are lying. You have people that would say that, we're covering the Iraq war and we want our country to win. So that's why I'm embedded with the US Army. So yeah, that's not really objective. So it's a bigger ailment than the journalism in Sudan. But like I said, we're not in the business of shaping opinion, but asking the questions. If there is a popular opinion and it's based on faulty data, then that's really the core of our mission, to go and unpack that and ask the right questions and really, bring reality to the masses.
For us, being a hub in the middle of the space between the local organizations who have monitors around the ground, and we have already our monitors around the ground, but they don't have access to the international media or access to raise up their voices. And so those who are in the ground feeling that they trust us and their data is secured with us, make them provide us with the best data and the most recent and the most credible and the most valid data. So we have a platform of, as you said, more than 21K piece of information that some of them are already valid and ready to use. And also this hub having strong relations with the international media entities and organizations and the most credible media entities that trust us as providers with the valid and credible data, put us in a good position that we can have the answers and having the data of anything that's happening in the ground and having the way to proceed this data and to deliver it to the other entities and organizations that work on verify it and publish it. So that amplify the voices of those who are in the grassroots who don't have access, and also giving the international media the right opinion of the people and the actual things that happening in the ground.
Wait, is it on? Oh yeah, it's on. Sorry, this thing is really confusing me. Yeah, thank you guys for both of your answers. I think so. There's a question that's sort of asking about the practical nature of like collecting information about the war, like just the pragmatic everyday sort of logistics of it. And with many reporters, we see that they have to either, go along with the army, or I don't know if there's been reported cases of some journalists like walking around with RSF, but you have to sort of negotiate with the state to have access to certain stories. And so I'm wondering how reporters and monitors from both Sudan Human Rights Hub and IAN sort of have to confront like, this inherent contradiction of like being critical and maintaining a sort of distance from the power, like the networks of violence that circulate in Sudan, but on a very practical level, also have to engage and deal with them to tell these stories.
The answer is we don't have to deal with them. But seriously, I mean, we don't publish using any bylines. So our journalists are not exposed to the officials. We've had this problem consistently in Sudan, where you register as a correspondent or as a media house, and you're going to have NISS at your office every day giving you a red line and like, you have to take this article out, you have to take that article out. So we haven't been in an environment, even during the transitional period, the red lines still applied. The electronic crimes laws still applied. Every single one of these laws and legislations that made it a hostile environment for journalists still involved. So we just made the choice that we're not gonna, publish our bylines. We're gonna protect our journalists. We're gonna have them work under the radar and have the content stand on its own, and that is basically because we really can't afford to go to SAF's, military intelligence office and tell them that, hey, we want to cover, and, we might want to cover your violations also. Like that, it just never flies. So and that's kind of been what we've doing for a long time. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Now, people in the journalist community look at that as like, a little bit of an unprofessional way of doing things. And I'm like, yeah, you don't have a functioning government. Like, it's just goes hand in hand.
Actually, the same. This managing this kind of contradiction needs some collaboration or maybe coordination between the different warring parties and us, and we don't do that, and they don't even like us, and they don't even let us work. If they know that who is monitoring this data, they will just arrest you, or you will just disappear. So depending on the alternatives ways and open source media in collecting data and publishing the productions and reports, like as Mosaab said, we don't need to have a lot. All we do is just collect the statements of the things that are happening and the statements of the officials from different both parties, and that collaborate that with the findings of our reports, not rather than that.
So I have a final question in mind that I think could close this panel nicely, but I want to open up the floor to any questions that the audience may have before we sort of segue towards closing up. Oh, yes, Nisreen?
To Mosaab, I guess to both of you actually, but as someone who has been trying to kind of, how do I put this? I mean, Khalud and I were just talking about this. I feel like in the social media space, try to respond to kind of pro-SAF analysis, especially when it gets picked up by non-Sudanese people. But then oftentimes people will come back with you're a privileged diaspora voice. You don't represent the people on the ground. I mean, I have lots of family members on the ground as well who I think, some whatever. Like I think there are ways that in the diaspora, at least, people can frame things as you're far removed and hence why you're taking this privileged anti-war position. And I was wondering, given your work, do you see the majority of the people that you're, representing, writing stories about, the journalists that are in Sudan who are reporting, reflect that or not? Yeah.
Yeah, and this is, where once we open up our floor, virtually for opinions, I remember we were doing a piece on the issue of arming civilians, in response to RSF's expansion, and one of the interviewees was a prominent civil society member in Al-Gadarif, Ja'far Khidr. And he was basically saying that, listen, guys, like before RSF came to Madani, nobody in Gadarif was talking about picking up arms. But as soon as they went into Madani, everybody's like, hey, you got a Kalashnikov? Like, it was automatic. People started, and this then goes into the area of coverage where we're covering RSF violations, but we're also covering SAF violations in the form of aerial bombardment and things like that. And I think it's always a dilemma once it comes to the whole taking sides thing. We're not politicians, like we're journalists. So our job is much easier because we're observing and reporting on what's happening on the ground. The most that we get is that, yeah, they should bomb Al because that's where the RSF is. You know what I mean? And it's that kind of rhetoric that doesn't hold up. These are emotional, reactionary, comments and things like that. But when it comes to the idea of, keeping the eye on the ball of the people of Sudan are suffering in this war. And yes, there's violations on both sides. And once we start getting into it, where we start looking at who started the war and why it started and stuff like that, this is where we would rather talk to experts and talk to people who can actually voice those concerns. But it is an uphill battle, especially right now. And I mean, it's hard to tell someone who has a village raided by RSF not to, take that stance and say, no, we're going to kick them out and everything. But as soon as it comes into, yeah, because the UAE wants to colonize Sudan, like, yeah, we've covered that as well. And Egypt has been coercing Sudan for a very long time. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like bringing out that kind of information in a form of a report or an investigation, an infographic, a short video, like just trying to diversify the ways of trying to get that message across. But again, we don't publish using our bylines and everything. So we don't get much of the heat, but we see the rhetoric happening, and it's unfortunate. But like I said, I really do think that rhetoric is starting little by little because of the fragmentation within the camps and with the, pro-SAF camp and everything. I think little by little that rhetoric is starting to, it's on the decline, I think. But I mean, I could be wrong, but the contradictions are too much of, within the pro-SAF camp to say that Burhan is the best leader ever and we're all going to be behind him and he's going to crush, everything and he's going to liberate Sudan. And, it's just, it's insane when you think about it. But that's where also like, people on the ground kind of just giving them the space to talk about their experiences and to express them and everything. I mean, people were really mad at us the first time we started reporting on how SAF is indiscriminately bombing areas in Darfur with civilians and marketplaces in South Khartoum and stuff like that. But you just have to bob and weave and just keep it moving,
Yeah. Oh. Oh. Yeah. Oh, you can. Are you sure? Yeah.
I think my question is to your point about content that you want to diversify the content. So there are two things. The first thing is that after the war, a lot of like the older generation who didn't use social media as much are now using social media. That's their only source of information. They're trying to see what is happening, who's talking about what, and they don't really like seek actual information. It's just, oh yeah, like this person who's pro staff, everybody listens to him, so we're just gonna, I don't want to mention his name, but yeah, we're just gonna tune into this person and we're gonna believe whatever he says, even though it's like misinformation. So I think the first part of my question is, how do you target this audience who have limited knowledge about social media and how propaganda is being used in this war, and how the SAF have control over social media, but the RSF have actual um, control on the ground. And then the second part is, you were saying reports, investigative reports, and infographics. But I think my part is there any way to humanize the data where a person could come out and talk similar to the pro staff, like investigate, they're not even investigators, like the people who talk on social media, um, without jeopardizing the safety and security of people who are on your team?
Short answer, unfortunately, is no. Like the space, like, you know, we recognize like Sudan, there's a very rich like oral tradition, you know, we are a very oral culture. So someone opening up a Facebook Live and like, you know, talking smack for like half an hour is always going to get more hits than our latest report. Like that's, unfortunately, that's just how things go. But again, like I said, like, you know, if you're loud, obnoxious, and wrong, like that's not going to go so far. It might work for like riling up people's emotions and like the reactionary side of like, you know, looking at the country and the nation and all of that. But little by little, it breaks down. Like, you know, I'm ashamed to say, like, I've followed some of like, you know, the live Batia on Facebook Live people, just really amazed at like, you know, what the heck is this? And little by little, you start seeing them like holding their line in the beginning of the war and then started infighting. You know, the infighting is going to happen because like you start realizing like, oh, this is Salah Ghosh's guy. You know, oh my God, this guy is actually down with Ghandur. Like, you know what I mean? It starts actually surfacing. Like, you know, the stink starts like, you know, the smell starts, you know, emitting little by little. And even on, and there's two sides to it, you know, so one side is like riling people up and riling up their emotions and trying to get people to, you know, join the war and stuff like that. And, you know, another part of it is then, you know, the cracks start to show, you know, and, you know, the only thing we can do is start to kind of improve our content, but also there's no single broadcast media that represents independent Sudanese media and like pro-democracy and liberation media. So that's kind of a shortcoming on our side, but that would have been the perfect alternative to that, is to get people, yeah, you can open up and see someone on Facebook Live, but it would be much better if people, as far as like IDP camps, can just switch the dial, you know, after the Real Madrid and Barcelona game, they can actually go and watch, you know, some rhetoric that actually makes sense. So we have a lot of work to do, like as far as us, but we, you know, unfortunately we can't go to that level of like, you know, bringing up influencers and having them compete. It's like, you know, it's a very, you know, toxic environment, and it's based on misinformation, like in the first place. So trying to compete with that, you're only just gonna, you know, get dragged in the mud, you know, too much. So, and giving people their voices, like I keep emphasizing this, is that keep giving people their own voices and coverage and amplifying those voices, I think is just the best antidote to like the madness that we see. And don't even get started like places like Clubhouse and, you know, these kind of apps is just like, you know, it's you know, it's full of military intelligence, RSF intelligence, national security. These people, it's a concentrated effort to, you know, where they're by getting people on their side. So it's not just innocent influencers or anything like that. It is a coordinated effort, and that's why like we don't want to roll with them in the mud.
Yeah, Dan?
So in the spirit of the title of the session, which was Archiving Destruction, I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between kind of journalism and history. And you mentioned earlier in response to one of the questions about navigating the kind of when to do shorter sound bites and when to do longer form journalism, and noted that for the international sphere, it was kind of, there was no way to figure out what stuck when. But do you think about, or should you think about the role of journalism as being archival, being for history, or are the problems too urgent? And I maybe reflect on it in the context of Sudan, but kind of more generally philosophically, should that be what journalists are up to, or does the archive get produced from people doing journalism in urgent situations in the contemporary, and that's what we should rely on journalism as representing in the archive?
I think it's for, even if we're covering stuff for the urgent, like you know, there's a huge overlap between the two, you know, as you said, but the idea of, you know, logging in events using just the bare 5 W's for it has a huge historical value. I think the time that we're in right now is what makes it a little bit different and makes this question a lot more complicated. But we're now in the digital space where everything is logged in digitally. You know, back in the days, you know, you have to go to the library, you have to, you know, get the newspaper machine, start looking back at the articles and start bringing things from the archive. But when we do these long investigative reports, we want to do them for the historical value, but also we want it to be a little bit more impact journalism. Like we want to help out if there's a civil society group or like a grassroots group that's working on a certain issue, then we want to work with them so that we make sure that report, that they can use it when they're doing advocating for their cause. So we haven't, to tell you the truth, we haven't put a lot of emphasis on the, how does this fit in within the historic trajectory? And I guess because that's usually not what journalists are thinking about. You know, it's hard to do that. But little by little, we start working with, for example, researchers. Researchers are all about that. Researchers are all about looking at things, if they're happening right now, within their historical context. So we have like a monthly bulletin called the Sudan Conflict Monitor. Once you go there, you'll start seeing that it's a much different tone because it's putting things within their historical context. So we, you know, sometimes with, if our news is not getting enough out to enough people, we would say that, okay, this is more for historical records. But you know, I don't think for journalists that should ever be the first goal. And because as much as there's a flood of information these days, you really do need someone with that journalistic ethic to start putting, even if it's a current event, just to put it in its right context. You know, not necessarily its historical context, but it's you know, it's reporting and it's mass media context. So I know I didn't answer your question completely, but thanks.
Ibrahim, if you can answer the same question, just because Sudan Human Rights Hub kind of occupies this interesting space where they literally you've literally created an archive, but you also sort of work within this media ecosystem and with journalists to make sure that this information is distributed in an urgent matter. Like you mentioned, the UN fact-finding mission, and how that's going to play a pivotal role in holding people accountable for the human rights violations that have taken place within in the context of the war of the past year, or over a year now. So I'm wondering, yeah, is this archive, what is the future of it? Is it designed to address more short-term goals, or is it is the idea that it'll exist as a part of historical record, since it kind of occupies?
Okay, I think also we have a better position than Mosaab, because Mosaab and I like facing the challenge of publishing news as soon as it happens. We are not in the pressure of publishing news. We are working on investigations, and investigations sometimes take very long time. Maybe sometimes for verification of one video take 2 to 3 months. So we take our comfort way to work, and mainly we collect all the data and preserving them in a good way that we can use it even after many years, maybe after 10 years, when we come to do some investigations about incident that happened in a certain place in Sudan during the war in 2023, we can do that easily. So this is the main way of working on archiving and preserving these data and putting them in a way that is easily filtered for us and easily shareable for the other people. So working on an investigation, the investigation also gives you a way to put the context of the whole thing. So if you get back to read the investigation after 10 years, you can recall the context of the things that are happening. So yeah, we have the option of doing this.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for your wonderful sharing, and I really admire your work. I just want to ask more about the process of recruiting journalists. So I wonder, like, how do you find the people who work for your team? What are you looking for in a journalist? And when you recruit, are they mostly already have experience, or like they have zero experience and you train them on the ground, like local reporters starting from scratch? Thank you.
That's a good question. A lot of the coverage that we get are coming from people who contact us. They either journalists would contact and say, hey, I'm in this area and I can do coverage for you. So, that, and if they're journalists by training, and through kind of circles of trust or degrees of kind of trust, we usually, it's a done deal for us. Like that's exactly what we need. The more challenging thing is to find people in areas that are underreported. There's always news deserts around Sudan, and I think this applies, internationally. That's where we would train someone, especially when it comes to, visual documentation, video reports. It's not hard to train someone. Of course, it's a challenge to train them remotely, but that's why also the editorial process and have them go, as long as we get the raw material, then we take it through an editorial process. And to be honest, like since the beginning of the war, we had more people approaching us and telling us that we're in this area and we can do coverage. And the main reason is because they don't see their issues being reflected in the media. So they want their stories locally to be told. So that's kind of generally how we've dealt with it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Jordan, yeah. So I just cannot see anything. Sun's in my face. No, it's okay. I got my shades on. Sorry.
Yeah, my question really for Ibrahim, but both of you really, is I know that as a hub, you're responsible for getting out investigations on violence to the international community. How do you think about the kind of predatory humanitarianism that can become an effect of the way that the international community comes to see or look at Sudan, as a result of being exposed to or becoming aware of the ongoing violence there? So there's a way that obviously the international community begins to, let's say, see Sudan as a place for them to, a problem for them to solve. And so how do you think about your investigative work as resisting that kind of international exposure or those kind of international attitudes, whilst at the same time like making sure the news gets out there about what's happening? And I'm sure this is a live question for you as well. Yeah.
I think it's a question for both of us because Mosaab are mainly working on publishing a lot of things regarding this. But we have something called localization, and we all support localization, that having a collaboration between the international interventions and those people who are in the ground. They have the right to work on this. So having a balance of these things by showcasing the main issues that facing the humanitarian issues and the humanitarian aid, and also not relying only on the international interventions just to do the whole thing themselves. We can just balance between the localization of those who are inside the ground and also linking them with the international communities by showcasing these problems and giving them, say, as Musab said, some questions on how to resolve that and how to work on that. If I don't know if that makes sense or I said so.
Absolutely.
I think the problem with the Sudan coverage, going back to even when we were young, covering the South Sudan war and everything, it was always either kind of just, painting the picture of people are either victims, needing help, and stuff like that, without giving any kind of agency to people on the ground and who are actually going through it. So I think for us, we've tried to do the balance of saying, yes, there are atrocities happening, and yes, there's atrocities against communities and against, individuals and stuff like that. But also, here's how people are fighting back. Here's how people are, helping out each other through mutual aid, through projects, through everything, and like even to the level of, peace building, like, the efforts on the ground of people who are actually keeping the peace and talking to both sides and stuff like that. And also, the resistance. We've covered the resistance committees and the protests and everything extensively, just to also show that, there is an intrinsic motivation among Sudanese to liberate themselves, to create a better tomorrow, and they're fighting for it, tooth and nail, just to kind of eliminate this idea that, anybody over there is waiting for a savior, to come and, uplift them out. And I think this is where also, I think we're at a time also where this whole idea also of like, Western organizations coming, swooping in and saving a country, I think that's dead right now, even to begin with. So we're also, I think, at a point in like world history where we're starting to move where, the global South is starting to be taken a lot more seriously, and, a lot more agency and a lot more, respect, as far as, it might not show in the material reality right now, but the attitudes are changing. Even if we talk about changes of attitude on the continent, if you take any region in Africa right now, people are waking up, are starting to move, and are refusing this, colonial idea of, waiting for some kind of savior or anything. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how we fit in all of that, but just like giving people their agency and letting them tell their own stories, I think is a good starting point for that.
So with that, we'll conclude this panel. Thank you to Mosaab and Ibrahim for your generous insights and for this really productive conversation, which I think has really tied so many threads that have carried on from yesterday and into from the last panel. Have tied them all together so beautifully. So we'll break for 15 minutes and we'll conclude with the final panel on archiving Sudanese music, led by Elsad and Haneen. So yeah, we'll see you all in 15 minutes at 3:30.